Today we are going to do a brake bleed. I have these Shimano MT501 520 brakes. It's the dual piston, but really any Shimano brake is going to bleed exactly the same way as this. Let's get rolling. First thing we need to do, and this part is very, very important, we need to remove this pin and take these pads out and put them in a safe place where they're not going to get contaminated. If you get oils from your fingers or mineral oil or anything on these pads, they're going to be really, really, really bad. So we just bend that pin, take it out, and then we take the pads straight out the top. Now on the lower level brake sets, the pads don't come out the top like this, they come out the bottom down here. But we're going to go ahead and take these out and set them to the side. On these there are two sets of pistons, two on either side. These pistons are ceramic. Now they're not like ceramic like ball bearings, they're ceramic like porcelain. They're very, very brittle. Any kind of sharp impact or pressure can cause them to chip or crack. So anytime we want to try and push these pins out, we need to make sure that it's a nice wide flat object that we use to push it out. I like to push it out with the brake pad in there. Now let's see if we can fit our spacer in here. This is going to have to come in from the bottom. Okay, so we can fit this thing in here just fine. So there's no need to push the pads out. If we did need to push the pads out, I would recommend that you put the pads back in, push them out with a screwdriver, or maybe push them out with a tire lever or something flat and soft, but you want to be gentle that you don't scratch the pads up. Just going to put this pin back in here. Some people like to bleed these brakes with the pads in. I find that 9 times out of 10 I contaminate the pads. And that one time out of 10, if I don't contaminate the pads, I still don't get the proper amount of oil in here because this is designed to keep those pistons a certain distance apart. And if the pads are in there, then sometimes you can push those the pistons a little too far in, and you do what they call overbleeding, where you have too much oil in there and you're not able to push them out far enough. I want to show you a real quick demonstration about how these pistons work and how the self-adjusting mechanism works. Inside the piston there is kind of a O-ring or a seal. It's like a round flap, and it's embedded in the caliper body itself, but this caliper piston is it's kind of holding on to it, and it has a certain amount of flex. It'll flex out a certain distance, and then it'll return that same distance. Now, on these pads, I'm sorry, on these pistons, if I squeeze this lever, you can see that they move out and then back again. Right? And I'm not squeezing the lever very much, just a little bit. And if I squeeze the lever a little bit farther, they come out, and then they don't come back in quite as far. And the reason is that these pistons are pushing out as far as the little seal can hold on, and then they push past however far the seal flexes. And then when that seal pulls it back into place, the seal only comes back so far, and that piston has gone farther than that. So it only comes back as far as that seal can go, and then it sets back a new normal spot. That's why when the pads wear down, you often have to push these back in whenever we replace the pads with new ones. So we need to start by filling up our syringe with this mineral oil. Now, all Shimano brakes use mineral oil. Really any mineral oil would do. I happen to have a very big tub of the Shimano mineral oil, so that's what I'm going to be using. And then you see we've got our little pesky bubble in here. Having bubbles in the syringe isn't really going to hurt anything. You just want to make sure that you don't let that bubble get out of the syringe into the system. But if you want to get rid of that bubble, all you have to do is bring it up to the top near that and just push back out into the bottle. And then this little sleeve here, we can push on to that little nipple. It's hard to get all the way on there, so they included this guy, and that's what this little arm is for. It's for pushing that sleeve the rest of the way onto that nipple, so you can prevent this from coming off while you're bleeding it. There we go, it's like a little clamp. Next up, we're going to install the cup that we're going to be bleeding into up here on the lever end. Now this little cover here, don't need to worry about that. The only thing we need to take off is this one bolt here. There's also a small O-ring attached to this. So when we take this out, we want to make sure that we get that little O-ring with it. Here it is right here. And then we're going to take our cup. There's not really any need to have any fluid in this because we are doing a full bleed, and we're just going to put the cup right on there. Be very, very careful. This thing is plastic and the threads are plastic. You just want to get it on there until it starts giving you some resistance and then stop. Alright, so I've got this positioned here. The screwdriver is to just kind of weigh this down. The curvature of this hose kind of keeps this thing from being level. So that's just sitting there, and you can see I've got a bubble in my syringe. It's fine being there. It's not hurting anybody. We just want to make sure that the bubble doesn't make it to here, because then we're going to be pushing that bubble into our system, and that's what we want to avoid. So now that we are ready to bleed, we're going to open the bottom of the system here by just unscrewing this little nipple. You don't have to unscrew very far. I do about a turn, maybe less, and now we just push the fluid through. And as you can see over there, there's fluid coming out, and look at how gross it is. So most of that fluid in there is the fluid that came out, that was in here for quite a while, and you can see how black it is. There's a lot of particulates in there. Most of that is particulates that work their way in through this caliper up here, because that's really the only open portion. It's just when those pistons push in, a little bit of brake dust can get on those pistons. Then when they push back out, that brake dust can sometimes work its way into the system and then get circulated through. That's why it comes out in that ugly, ugly color. But we can see pretty clearly underneath all that nasty oil. We were able to push some of this good oil up into there. So we should be pretty clean now. So now we want to use this little plug to plug the bottom of the cup and keep any more of that nasty oil from getting out of this cup. We will tighten our little nipple here. And we're going to unscrew this and try not to make a mess. We're going to put this O-ring back on our cap, and we're going to reinstall this cap. This doesn't take very much force to tighten. You don't want it to get too tight because that's a very, very tiny, tiny bolt. Now, one last thing I like to do on the caliper side after I've closed up the lever is I'm going to open this back up again, and I'm going to give this thing another squeeze. I'm going to make sure that there is plenty of oil in there. I'm almost like pressurizing the system a little bit. And then we close it off, get it nice and tight. And then to avoid some mess, what I do when I pull this out is I apply a little bit of pulling force to this syringe and then take that off. And that suction helps to draw this mineral oil back into the syringe instead of getting all over that caliper. After I've very thoroughly washed my hands and washed the parts, it's time to put the pads back in. And the way these go on the spring is you kind of put those outside edges over the top there, and then we'll sandwich this piece in here. And we'll go ahead and assemble this whole thing and then squeeze it together and put it right on in there. And just bend that piece back. There we go. All done. Time to put on the bike. So these brakes have a really interesting feature where you see this clamp can't open all the way, but if we push this little button, then it does allow it to open all the way. And we can install it, close it back, and then once it closes, it can kind of hang on of its own volition until we put the screw in. So with this particular system, we have the rotor that is designed for this bike is a 160 millimeter rotor, but we have a 203 rotor that is going on this. So we need the appropriate adapter. Now this one here, it adapts a 160 to a 203 specifically. Your rotor may, or your adapter may need to be different than this. And this actually has bolts that hold the adapter on, and then separate bolts that hold the caliper on. Also, there's always an arrow that says up on these. You can think of it as up, or you can think of it as this is the direction that the hose is going. And with these adapters, there's not really any adjusting to be done. Just bolt it in all the way, get it good and tight, and then move on to the caliper. So here, this caliper has a lot of movement side to side. This is intended for you to center the caliper with the rotor. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and just snug both of these down, but they don't really need to be very tight because we're going to be moving them anyways. Now it's time to center the caliper around the disc rotor. And the way I like to do this, there's a lot of different methods that people like to use. The way I like to do it is I'll take both of these bolts, the top one and the bottom one, and I'll break them loose and then just snug them up to hold them in place. I'll take the bottom one, break it loose, just snug it up, hold it into place. And then I'll visually look at this gap on the inside. Now it may not be visible on the camera, but this the disc rotor is touching this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one side at a time. I'll start with this top, and I'll loosen it and then just nudge it over a little bit in the direction I want it to go, and then snug it back into place. Then I'll take the other one, loosen it, and then push the caliper over just a hair. Oh, it kind of got away from me there a little bit. Push it over just a hair, snug it into place, and I'll do that little bit by little bit until I can see a gap on both sides. Now if you are having trouble seeing through, let me see if I can find this on the camera. There we go, we can see a little gap on both sides. Looks like it's still a little bit close on this side. And I'm not fully tightening this, I'm just giving it a little bit of a snug back into place. And I move this around a little bit, and you can see, move that spring around, that there is a gap on both sides now. If you struggle being able to see the gap, maybe put something light colored down on the floor, or shine a light through so you can see that gap and see a little bit more contrast. Now, after we have adjusted this and centered it by sight, we want to take another second to squeeze the brake a little bit. Squeeze it several times. You may find that because we push those pistons out that it has to take a little bit of time to self-adjust. And then we look to make sure that it is still centered. And I'm going to spin this wheel. And I can't hear any rubbing, so we know that we successfully centered this, and now we got to move on to the back. Alright folks, that's another video in the bag. I hope you learned something. If you did, please give me a like. If you subscribe, then you get to see more videos like this. And if there's anything in particular you'd like to see, drop it in the comments and I'll see what I can do to accommodate that. Thank you so much for watching.